Welcome back to yet another episode of Hamlet at Bardfest 2019, the podcast. I'm the director of Hamlet at Bardfest in 2019 and your host, Doug Powers. This episode we're going to devote to setting Hamlet, how and when and where and why to place this play. And we're calling it Bounded in a Nutshell. So first, some of the particulars. Bardfest will be going on October 17th through the 27th in Indianapolis. You can go to www.indiebardfest.com for lineup and details. We are going to be on both stages at the Indy Fringe Theater and on the main stage at the District Theater on and around Massachusetts Avenue in downtown Indianapolis. In addition to Hamlet, the lineup will include Henry IV Part 1, a youth production of The Tempest, and Lear's Shadow, a regional premiere of a play that is a new work and not certainly by William Shakespeare. The unfortunate news is that the production of Two Gents, the adaptation of Two Gentlemen of Verona, will no longer be in the festival. A sad development, but now we have the exciting opportunity to bring the regional premiere of a new work that is Shakespeare adjacent. It's the 5th year of Bardfest, and a lot of other nationally known Shakespeare festivals have at least one play in their lineup that is not Shakespeare. So, in a sense, this is an opportunity for Bardfest to sort of grow up even more than it has, and to expand beyond the canon of the works of William Shakespeare himself. So, again, indiebardfest.com, October 17th through the 27th. Another update I want to bring is for our The Bard Gives Back campaign. This is our fundraising / community service program by which when people donate to our crowdfunding campaign, they do so by choosing one of our partner organizations in the community. And each time one of those partner organizations gets a total of $100 in donations, we will dedicate one of the performances of Hamlet to that organization. They'll get the opportunity to present their message to the audience, and they will also receive a donation of part of the proceeds from that night's performance. As of right now, out of our 7 performances, we have 3 of them dedicated, and so we have 4 more to go, and our goal is to get the remaining 4 performances dedicated before the end of August. So some of our partners, 2 of them in fact, are within $25 of the mark. So check out, you can go also to indiebardfest.com, and on the More menu, the third option down is The Bard Gives Back. You can go to that page and learn more about how the program works, check out our 10 partner organizations, and from there click the donate button, which will take you to the PayPal page where you can pick which partner you want to donate on behalf of and help us give back. We can, the way the program works, in order to give back, we have to get your help. So if you will, go check that out also. In terms of our production of Hamlet, this week we have started rehearsals in earnest. We had our first read-through and our first fight choreography rehearsal last week. And this week we have begun actually doing table work and a little bit of scene work. So we are underway, coming at you in October. And we're getting ready now, and there's already really exciting stuff happening. So we'll be certain to keep you up to date as the weeks progress. In other Shakespeare news, the other productions that we spoke of, Noblesville's Macbeth and Indy Shake's Hamlet, have both closed. Had quite successful runs, which is great. The one that is remaining is Garfield's As You Like It. Garfield Shakespeare Company is presenting As You Like It. It opens this weekend. It's directed by Carrie Shea, who, as I've mentioned before, has a history with Hamlet. He played Hamlet for First Folio Productions showing of Hamlet in 2016. But As You Like It, under his direction, and including at least one of our cast members and other fine folk, that runs August 16th through the 31st at the McAllister Amphitheater in Garfield Park. In other theatrical news, the Indianapolis Theater Fringe Festival opens this weekend as well. This time I didn't see any Shakespeare adjacent works. There's often something to do with Shakespeare among the lineup, but I didn't see anything this year, but that's okay. There's still a lot of local Shakespearean actors who are involved in other productions in the Fringe Festival, so I highly encourage you to check that out as well. That will be running for 10 days coming up starting this weekend, so go see some Fringe. And as always, if you know of any Shakespeare productions going on in the area that I haven't mentioned, drop me a line. I will get them added to future episodes. I've been running a feature on this podcast that I've called the Odd Word of the Week. And, I got to thinking about it, and odd seems like a sort of judgmental term. So we're going to just start referring to this as our early modern English vocabulary of the week. And this week's word is springe, springe. Both Laertes and Polonius mention using springes to catch woodcocks, which are birds. And a springe is simply a trap. It's a snare or noose sort of trap that's used for catching small birds, such as woodcocks, and small game, things like that. So Polonius talks about Hamlet's overtures of love to Ophelia as springes to catch woodcocks, and Laertes, when he reveals his treachery at the end, again, you've had your chance to avoid spoilers for a 420-year-old play, but when he does that, he says to Osric that he is like a woodcock to his own springe. So, springe is your latest early modern English vocab lesson. So, moving on to our actual topic of the week, which is setting Hamlet. Now, in general, when it comes to setting Shakespeare plays, I personally am not an early modern era purist. I don't think it has to be done in doublets and hose as it would have been originally. Shakespeare didn't worry about details such as that. There are people in Julius Caesar, which is ostensibly set in the Roman Empire, who mention doublets and who mention a clock tower, neither of which would have been around in the Roman Empire. So if Shakespeare didn't worry about it, my philosophy is we don't have to worry about it either. So I think you can set a Shakespeare play whenever and wherever you want, with the caveat that I think it's important that there be a reason why you're setting it that way, and that reason allows the setting to enhance the story. Occasionally one will run across fairly gimmicky, in my judgment, settings for Shakespeare plays, and where it becomes about, oh, hey, wouldn't it be cool to see it in this setting? Not because it enhances the story, but because somebody thought it would be a novelty. Long years ago, a friend of mine used to joke about setting King Lear in the Klingon Empire, which could actually work, but it probably wouldn't. I'm saying it could, but it would be a very niche audience, to say the least. But I also think at that point you are getting into that territory of having a gimmicky setting that is there for the setting's sake and not for the story's sake. So that's just one example. But in general, I personally prefer to set Shakespeare at some point earlier than the past, say, quarter century or so. And my reason for that is that I think it helps to explain why the characters don't just solve whatever their problems may be using cell phones or email or something like that. But on the other hand, any setting you do for a play that's from the era is going to be a sort of pretend imaginary version of that setting, even if you try to recreate it as faithfully as you possibly can, the way the Stratford Festival often does, which even their theater is constructed the way the Globe would have been originally. Even then, you're still not completely setting it in the completely historically accurate version of that setting. So there's always an element of imagination. There's always an element of pretend. It's a fantasy version of whatever setting you do. So if you want to do an imaginary version of the modern era where people can't solve their problems using cell phones and email, then so be it. But there's personal preference. I think it just avoids a lot of questions in the audience's mind. For example, last year when we set The Merchant of Venice in the 1930s, it was very obvious why people didn't just pick up a cell phone or send an email. You still have some things like travel to another country was a lot faster even in the 1930s than it would have been in the 1590s. However, it just avoids some of those questions, I think, to have the setting be in an era where a lot of our modern trappings wouldn't have been there. So in thinking about how we wanted to set Hamlet in particular, again, if the setting is to serve the story, then one of the questions that I wrestled with was, what do I need out of the setting in order to support the story that I'm trying to tell? And because I do want to include, and not just include, but sort of lean into the Fortinbras storyline, it's helpful to set that in a time of political turmoil. And if you're setting it in Europe, your options for periods of political turmoil are many. But it's important, I think, to have one of those. Ideally, I wanted a time when swords would still have been an actual implement of war. People would still have been fighting with swords, even if it wasn't the primary thing they fought with. And I wanted a period when there were still monarchs who wielded power, not just figureheads, not just heads of state, but also the head of government. I also wanted a time when there would have been a conflict between sort of the old ways and the new, sort of an intellectualism versus, for lack of a better term, superstition. And on a more practical level, I wanted a period that we could costume, and costume well, on a limited budget. That's another reason not to set Shakespeare in the early modern era, is that accurate costumes from that era that actually look right and look good are incredibly difficult and incredibly expensive to pull off. Just oodles and oodles of fabric, and of particular kinds of fabric, will go into any accurate garment of that era. It's just a nightmare. I mean, they'll look gorgeous when you can get them right, but getting them right is next to impossible on anything approaching a reasonable budget. So, in that vein, some of the settings that we had discussed and talked about, Brian had always had a thought of setting it in the 17th, 18th century, making it a sort of Age of Enlightenment thing. You had sort of the old order, monarchy, religion, and versus the new order, reason, democracy, those kinds of things. And that's a fascinating setting to try to do it in. Personally, I had actually for a while fairly well settled on setting it in 1913, just before the sort of old monarchical colonial order of Europe was about to blow itself apart. However, both of those settings, when we got down to actually analyzing it and trying to do it, would have proven prohibitively difficult and expensive to recreate well. And so it failed. Both of those sort of fail on our final criterion, something we can actually make look good. So instead of being leading up to the period of the World Wars, we've gone the other direction, and we're actually setting Hamlet in the 1950s, or at least somewhere approximately in the middle of the 20th century. One, it's vastly easier to obtain props and costumes for. And instead of Fortinbras being a sort of harbinger of the conquering figures to come later, after 1913, Fortinbras becomes sort of an inheritor of that period, or an inheritrix, if we really want to get. So you have a Europe that has been through being torn apart by the wars, both of them, and is working to reassemble itself in some sort of new structure. And so you have a Fortinbras who, among other things, such as her deep desire for revenge against the state of Denmark for the death of her father, is also trying to take advantage of that sort of uncoalesced state of Europe, at least in our imaginary version of the middle of the 20th century. And again, while swords had more or less left warfare by that time, there still could have been, especially among royalty and the elites, some sort of holdout. Certainly the officer's saber was still very much a thing, mostly ceremonial by then, but it still existed. So, it meets our other criteria, and in the end, we'll have a show that we can put together and that will look good, and that will look, I'm not going to say it will look accurate, because we're not going for strict historical accuracy. What we are going for is to evoke a feel. We want our setting, this imaginary world, this imaginary Denmark that we're creating, to evoke what the costumes and the props of the 1950s or the middle 20th century will look like. So what the symbolism that those represent, or what we want to carry forward into our production. And let's face it, it's just going to look really cool, which is also, again, a consideration. Theater is a visual art as well as anything else, so we want it to look good, and with that setting, we're quite certain it will. I've already been having some conversation with our sound designer as well. Obviously, our moving the setting from 1913 to 1950s has an impact on that, and I think we're going to get some really interesting material out of that as well. There was a lot happening culturally, socially, economically, politically in the middle of the 20th century that I think will serve this story well, to evoke the symbolism and evoke the feel of those real events in our imaginary world. So I'll look forward to in October seeing how we bring all those elements together to create a visual package that helps us tell the story of the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, which we will be doing again October 17th through the 27th. Hamlet will be on the Basile stage of the Indie Fringe Theater on St. Clair Street. The rest of the festival will be on the Indy 11 stage at the Indie Fringe, and also at the District Theater on the main stage there. And again, along with Hamlet, you have Henry IV Part 1, Lear's Shadow, and a youth production of The Tempest. Again, you can go to indiebardfest.com. You can look up Indie Bard Fest on Facebook and Instagram, or First Folio Indie on Twitter for the overall Bard Fest Festival. For Hamlet specifically, you can look up Hamlet Bardfest on Facebook, Hamlet Bardfest 2019 on Instagram, Hamlet Bardfest on Twitter, and Hamlet Bardfest 2019 on YouTube. There's all kinds of good stuff on our YouTube channel, including the episodes of this podcast, which you can also find anywhere you get podcasts. We are hosted on Buzzsprout. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, TuneIn on your Alexa device, basically any app that services podcasts to you. You should be able to find this one. You can just search for Hamlet at Bardfest 2019, and you should be able to find us. So until next episode, thanks again for listening, and we will look forward to updating you with how our production comes together now that we're actually in rehearsals for it.